Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and today I have a very distinguished guest, Dr. Wesley Fisher. Now, he's the Director of Research for both the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, Claims Conference, and the World Jewish Restitution Organization, which is WJRO. He heads the Claims Conference, WJRO, Looted Art and Cultural Property Initiative. He is also a founder and deputy director of the executive board of the Jewish Digital Culture Recovery Project Foundation. I don't know how he remembers who he is, but okay. So, what we're going to talk about today is Nazi systematic looting of Jewish art. And I've asked Wesley to start as early as possible in this story, not where you, the audience, might expect. So, when did it begin?
Well, as of 1933, when Hitler took power, that started the whole program of Aryanization, in which Jews were being treated very badly, and the idea was to get them out of Germany or out of the system, not part of society and the like. When Raphael Lemkin coined the word genocide, he started off with the idea that indeed it starts with cultural genocide. And indeed that's the case. So as of 1933, Jews in Germany were already beginning to have their businesses taken away and also their collections of various cultural property, whether that was artworks or musical instruments or libraries or whatever, Judaica and so on. So this is something which begins quite early. And actually, people may not realize it, but in terms of the legal aspects of this, also were occurring in Italy quite early. Mussolini started these kinds of things against the Jews as of 1938, certainly. And by the time you get to 1938, which is still before the war as such, you're already dealing with pretty much mass takings of these kinds of collections that people had. So it was done in various ways. Partly it wasn't necessarily just outright confiscation, but in the beginning it was done through forced auctions, forced sales that people had because people had to owe money to the government, and if they wanted to escape Germany, they had to pay fees. So as a result, it was a way of getting these items, and in part it was done through simply taking those things that were left behind after people were killed or whatever. That of course becomes much more of a factor later on when in such things as the Möbelaktion, the furniture action, if you will, the idea that people who were deported to concentration camps and so on, that their homes then were ransacked. They just simply were taken. When I say ransacked, some of it was done in a real looting manner, but for the most part in Germany it was conducted in a quite systematic way, and so it was actually full scale writing down of what people were leaving or what they were being robbed of, and eventually this moves into much worse situations. So far as the theft is concerned, this became the greatest cultural theft in history, because you have to realize that this is not just Germany and it's not just the Germans. It encompassed the entire Reich as such, which means Austria as well, but it means also those occupied countries that Germany occupied, and it means also the allies of the members of the Axis, the countries that were allied with Nazi Germany. And in effect, this is something that sweeps throughout all of Europe. In Western Europe, it was done in quite a planned fashion. They knew they had major people who were scholars in regard to art and the like and where art was. And so when they invaded France, for example, they had listings of all the houses and the main collections that were held by primarily by wealthy people, but more than that. And so they took what they knew was there. This was also the case in a number of the other countries, and in Western Europe, it was done in an organized fashion, primarily against individual Jewish families and individual Jewish collections of various sorts and institutions and the like as well. When the Soviets, when the Soviet Union was invaded, when it gets to the point of the invasion of Eastern Europe, that's different
Okay,
because,
now we're talking 1941 when the Germans, June 1941, to break the pact with the Russians. Okay.
right. So in 1941, with the Soviets had already nationalized private collections. So it wasn't so much a matter of going after the individual Jewish families. It was instead a matter of going after the museums, the palaces, the places where these things were held. There was still, of course, theft from Jewish institutions and such that remained, but it was much more of a more general kind of theft. This was partly rationalized on the basis that Jew equals Bolshevik or Jew equals communist. So that was part of the reasoning on this. I might say that the rationale and the ideology for doing this, specifically in regard to cultural property of Jews, was partly it was the ideology that said that these were people who did not deserve to exist. These were people who were essentially should not have these benefits with them. And from that standpoint, under Rosenberg, the head of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the special task force, Rosenberg task force, the principal notion was to gather materials that said something about the Jews and Judaism. It was a know the enemy kind of stance. But there was also an ideology among the museums led by a man named Kümmel, who was the head of the German museums at the time, that all German art should be brought back to Germany or should be taken out of non-German hands. And so that's another part of this. And then, of course, there was simple greed. It was simple economic greed. And in the process, because Hitler and Goering, his second in command, had huge art collections as a result of all this, it became very fashionable among the Nazis, and there was a Nazi art market throughout Europe at the time, in which so some of these art pieces then shifted. They then moved from where they originally were to other countries and the like through the Nazis' art market. I might say
Wait,
that,
could I ask a question of my memory? I'm trying to remember the name of the movie. It might be The Cradle Will Rock, but didn't Hitler also use sales of some of these really prominent um, paintings that he didn't like? He sold them to get money for his war machine?
yes, the degenerate art, the in
Yes.
particular, what was considered to be degenerate art, modern art, basically, was indeed sold, and that was sold, and there were other things that were sold as well, things that they didn't like or whatever they felt that were not needed. But it wasn't just the things that were in the famous degenerate art exhibition that took place in the late 30s. But that is. Yes, that's also that's a part of the economic aspects of this. And so some of this was used as a way of dealing along with other property of the Jews and property of others, whether it was the Roma or the Masons or or whatever. But in this regard, it was not simply along those lines. It was also that they were seeing themselves as sort of creating a center for culture. And so you had Hitler with his own museum to be built in Linz, and you had these huge collections that were elsewhere at Hall, the estate that Goering had, and so on. I might say that in terms of the numbers of these things, it's worth thinking about this in terms of cultural property generally, because it's not just paintings, it's a great many other things as well. And from that standpoint, we're talking about millions of objects. There is no specific known numbers for this. There are estimates, but that's all they are. They're estimates, they're guesstimates in some respects. At the 1998 Washington Conference on Holocaust era assets, Jonathan Petropoulos, an art historian, made the estimate that about 650,000 paintings had been taken throughout Europe, of
Just
which
paintings alone.
paintings alone, yeah. And I mean, it may be, yeah, I mean, it's paintings, the artworks in the usual sense. But in fact, if we look at how many things were eventually returned by the monuments men, American, by the American forces, but the Allied forces generally, the Western Allied forces, those were in the millions in Germany alone. So we're talking also in terms of things that have multiple numbers. Libraries, books, the numbers of books, or stamps. You have a stamp collection. How many things is that? That kind of thing. But nonetheless, it's in the millions. And from that standpoint, this was the greatest cultural robbery that the world has ever known. Much more than had been stolen before that. And I don't believe that today the numbers are similar, but it is true that most genocides are accompanied by this kind of theft. So if you look at Ukraine today, or you look at questions of Cambodia or many of these other matters, you see some of the same patterns, but not to this extent. This is bigger than anything else.
So let's talk about for a minute where the Germans stashed all of their stolen goods, the salt mines, etc.
Well, towards the end of the war in particular, as it was clear that there were going to be attacks on Berlin, there were a great many things that were stored in the south of Poland or in Czechoslovakia, in castles, in salt mines, in various places, in churches, and there was a whole attempt to hide much of this, but some of it wasn't hiding, some of it was just simply taking it to make them safe from bombings and so forth that were occurring. As a result, a major matter that occurred at the end of the war was that in the East in particular, the Soviets, who did not want to restitute these to individual families, but instead took the notion of a philosophy of, quote, compensatory restitution, they proceeded to take these things wherever they could find them, and they took them to Moscow. Some things were taken to Minsk, and some things were eventually given to Ukraine and elsewhere in the Soviet Union. But basically, it all went to the centralized Soviet Union through Moscow. And in effect, this was a general robbery. It was an unusual matter in which all of these things then were taken by the Soviets. Many things were given back to Eastern Europe, to the East European communist countries in the 1950s and 60s, but it wasn't everything, and there is still a great deal in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, that has not been restituted and that is not necessarily known fully. Although from what I know, so far as the Russian Federation is concerned, the museums and the libraries and the like have, under state orders, made lists of what they received from the Soviet trophy brigades, as they were called.
Oh, Soviet trophy brigades. That's so. Let's go switch to the Americans and the Allies now. I mean, yes, Soviet Union was an ally, but the Americans. Why did the Americans realize what they had to do about the art?
Well, part of the Marshall Plan and part of the general attitude of the United States in particular towards what to do after the war was to not do what had happened after World War I, to not essentially impoverish Germany and essentially punish to that extent, rather to try to make good by at least returning things as the as to the extent that was possible. So far as that's concerned, in the beginning of the post-war period, that is, say, in the 1946-47 period, the Americans and the British and French were giving things back to individuals and were giving them things back to individual institutions. However, at the point where the Cold War began, the Cold War starts, in that period, but it's 1948, 49 that we're talking about. That at that point, the United States wanted to get out of the business of giving these things back. We're talking about enormous numbers of items that were brought together from a very large number of collecting points, and they were brought into 4 central collecting points of the United States. Those were at Munich, at Marburg, at Wiesbaden, and at the Offenbach Archival Depot. And those, they really were enormous. Indeed, the Offenbach Archival Depot, which dealt heavily with Jewish library and ritual Judaic and the like, was seen as the sort of the answer to the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, to Rosenberg's Special Task Force. It was redistributing to many countries in addition to within Germany. In any event, at that point in time, instead of continuing to do that, the United States started what they called external restitution. They began sending these items to the capitals of the countries from which they came. The Jews of the world would have they couldn't stand this idea because it meant giving these things back to the capitals of countries that had oppressed them, because it's not just the Germans.
Yes.
Under the circumstances, therefore, the Jews protested, and there was in particular discussion about the need for a successor organization, for a Jewish organization that would take care of these things. And indeed, such a Jewish Restitution Successor Organization, or JRSO, was formed. It was formed primarily within the US sector, but it also covered the British and the French sector through sort of friendly associations in addition. And that was something which was quite major. It became under the Military Law 59 in 1948. This became something which was actually a legal matter. So those items that clearly belonged to Jews were handed over to the JRSO, and the JRSO then became responsible for sending them around the world. Within the JRSO, there was the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, which was originally a scholarly group, and it involved Salo Baron and Hannah Arendt and others. And it came to the conclusion that many of these things, or most of these things, needed to go where the Jews were going, or had gone, or were going. And therefore, 40% of the, quote, airless properties, let's say nothing was airless actually, but airless in the sense that you couldn't tell to whom it had belonged.
Right.
40% of them went to what became Israel, 40% of them went to the United States, 20% went to the United Kingdom and to a variety of other countries, including in South America. And there were things, of course, that were returned to the still existing Jewish communities in Europe, but there were a lot of Jewish communities which no longer existed. And so that's why in Jewish museums in the United States, for example, there are a great many ritual Judaica items that, or we see the Torahs that came through the Czech Republic eventually. There in the synagogues, there are a number of things like this. But this is, of course, an issue, by the way, because as European Jewish communities gained strength and became once again part of European life, although they're having difficulties today, they wanted these things back. But technically speaking, these things are legally in the United States or in Israel and so on. They did make mistakes, however. There are some things that were sent by mistake.
What about individuals getting, the woman in gold? the Klimt paintings. How did that work, that individual restitution?
Well, there was not much attention paid to this whole issue from the end of the war to the 1990s. At the end of the war, there were claims that were filed, and people did try to get things back, and some things were returned. But for the most part, people who had been through the camps, people who had survived, didn't have the paperwork or the information about this. So you have some major families that had, major works where they knew those works must be somewhere, and they proceeded to try to get them back. But for the most part, there were problems with that, and many people did not receive anything back after the war. In the 1990s, as a result of the Swiss banks scandal and the issue of the Swiss banks and also many other things
Wait, let's just tell our audience, are we talking about the insurance scandal when they uh, two more sentences about the Swiss scandal?
Okay, there were a whole series of things in the 1990s. On the one hand, you had scandal about the Swiss banks itself. Senator D'Amato at that time picked this up and fought for this. And that was the Swiss banks were hiding what they had. Most recently, the fact is that most recently it's clear that Credit Suisse has things and that they have even now that they haven't revealed. So that was a big scandal, and that brought about a lot of other things, such as the insurance settlements and such as the slave labor fund and a number of other things like this. But in regard to the art, this was the last remaining art and cultural property. This was sort of the last remaining aspect that really hadn't been looked at. And so after there were a series of meetings on other matters, in 1998, at the end of 1998, under Stuart Eisenstadt of the United States, Ambassador Eisenstadt, who had been in the government, there was the Washington Conference on Holocaust era assets. I have to tell you, I was deputy director of that conference. In any event, that was the first time that there was really an attempt to get agreement on a set of rules, a set of ideas of how this should be handled. And basically these works should be identified, they should be made known, archives should be made open. There are, that in effect that there should be a way of handling this with the survivors, former owners or their heirs, and that commissions should be created to go through with this and the like. This was a major change. The art market really changed very greatly as a result, because before that, nobody was paying attention to the question whether or not something had been stolen before.
The provenance.
Right, yes. So in any event, this was, with that, things started to change, and you got a series of changes, particularly in some of the major countries. However, there were 47 countries that, well, I'm saying 47 because there were 44 countries at the Washington Conference, but there were 47 countries at the Prague Conference in 2009, which endorsed the Washington Conference principles of '98 again. And of those 47, we've done various listings and studies of how many countries have actually gone forward with this. And I have to tell you that half of the countries have done pretty much nothing. Of the others, there are about 7 who have done a lot, and then there are 3 that have done pretty much. And then you have, and so on. You have a little bit, others that have done something, at least. This is a problem, and it's a problem that the World Jewish Restitution Organization, where I work, tries to overcome. But it's also a difficulty because in terms of the records of this, that is to say where the archives are showing this, those archives were incredibly dispersed throughout the world. And they were partly dispersed because, for example, the Soviets, if they saw archives in their path in the East, they just took them all. So there's a lot that's in Moscow. There's, however, the largest set of record, and therefore the largest set of records of the ERR, the Einsatzstab Rosenberg that I was talking about before, is in Kiev. And there are things, of course, in Germany and in the United States and in many other countries, but this is a major puzzle that exists. We actually scanned the ERR records in Kiev in 2010. So there are other things like that that are happening.
Are they safe?
Are they safe? Well, the originals, I don't know about the originals. The originals hopefully have been protected by the Ukrainian archives, but that's a difficulty. That's actually a serious question. In any event, the information is safe because the fact that they were scanned means that you can see the scans on the internet, and there are copies, therefore, in a great many places. So that's not such a problem from the standpoint of the information itself. In any event, by the way, I should explain that the third organization that you referred to in your introduction of me is dealing precisely with this. It's trying to bring those archives together in digital form and to try to make them searchable using optical character recognition, artificial intelligence, and so on. That's a new sort of thing trying to do. But in any event, in any event, all of this has been a problem, and therefore, if we go to the question of how are these things being restituted today, you have different sorts of experiences. Among these experiences, the Germans, the French, the Dutch, the United Kingdom, and the Czech, well, some of the other countries have tried to create commissions that deal with these matters. But what happened was that when the representatives of these countries came back to their countries from the Washington Conference in 1998, they mostly all looked at the state collections in their museums, which was important, of course, but we knew very well, in the Jewish world, we knew very well this wasn't everything, because so much had been taken from private people, so much had gone into the art market, and might be anywhere in the world, so much had been destroyed, and so on. And so we pushed for the idea that you really need to go back to the archives of looting. This is now several decades of this. And that was an important thing, and therefore, finally, we started out by looking at some of the things that Einsatzstab Rosenberg had done. And in particular, we put together a first database of what they had taken in Paris at the Jeu de Paume, and it was organized at the Jeu de Paume, and we put that on the internet. That was the first time you could see what was taken from whom and what the fate of the object was. And so there are a series of things. Sorry.
Let me interrupt for a minute about the Jeu de Paume. I seem to remember that there was a young woman who was working there at the time who would memorize when she recognized Nazi collections I'm talking about in Paris, as the confiscated art was brought to the Jeu de Paume, and she would write down and remember, right? And it would help. So do you know that story?
Yes. Her name is Rose Valland, and Rose Valland is a celebrated heroine of France, and indeed there is a Rose Valland database also that deals with all these things, and it's quite important. But actually, the records were also there from the Germans themselves. That is to say, that had been preserved, and it was possible to see that on property cards in NARA, in the National Archives in the United States, and also at the Bundesarchiv, the Federal Archives of Germany. So it's putting all of that together that makes it possible to actually look at all these things. In effect, though, you also have to have a system of how the restitution takes place. So in France, for a very long time, what happened was that when they looked at everything that had gone on in the French banks and so forth at the end of the 1990s, what took place was that a an organization was created that was made it possible for people to receive compensation for artworks, but it was very difficult to receive the artworks themselves because there was a law in France that prohibited deaccessioning from the state collections. In other words, you couldn't get something from the state collections. That has now changed. That has now changed, and France is quite remarkable at the moment in that it is quite possible to continue to try to make claims and to get the actual paintings back if we're talking about the paintings as such. In other countries, there were different sorts of things. The Netherlands did a very good job initially, and it got, at a certain point, it changed its idea of what should happen in the restitution process. And so it talked about an equality of interests, whereby the interests of the museum that held the artwork would have the same right to say why it should be kept by them as the people to whom it had belonged. And that didn't work. And thank heaven, the Dutch have returned to a more general policy of returning things to the original owners or their heirs. But the Dutch have gone quite far in dealing with this in a general fashion. In other countries, things have been different. In the United States, unlike the European countries, which have ministries of culture, and the ministries of culture can say, well, this is what we're going to do, and essentially make it happen. Here in the United States, almost all museums are private museums. And so such a commission was thought to be it wouldn't make sense because you can't do it that way. So as a result, it's left more to the museums and the museum organizations, and it's also left ultimately to the courts. And that's why in the United States we have it's a varied matter, because the what is now the American Alliance of Museums, it used to be the American Association of Museums, and the Association of Art Museum Directors, the AAMD, they provided guidelines for this, for their museums to follow. But as you can realize, these guidelines it's correct advice, but there's no one necessarily who is enforcing them. So it's more difficult as a result. One of the major things, if you're talking about the woman in gold, one of the major things was the fact that in regard to that it became possible to sue in the United States for an artwork, by the way, which was in another country, physically was in Austria. And while that existed, and it was very encouraging and very important for a long time, more recently that's become more difficult. So you have this change recently in this in this case that concerns the painting by Pissarro that is held in Spain. You have the problem that the courts originally decided that what should reign is Spanish law, and the Spanish will not give it back. And instead, recently the Supreme Court has changed that to make it California law. That would because the state of California passed legislation on the matter, and so it's different now. But it's still a problem because you don't know whether or not it will be possible to actually physically get the artwork back from Spain because it's being held in Spain. And that's, it's that kind of difficulty. These things are all over the
I
world.
take it they're not paying any money for usage or anything, right?
No, there's nothing like that. In fact, actually, in some cases, when this began again, there were attempts by some of the museums, some of the countries, to get monies from the heirs or the original owner for having kept quote saved the artwork over these years, which was then, I think that doesn't happen anymore, but that was something in the past.
And I know I saw a documentary recently about how now and again, now, so many years after the war, people are beginning to find paintings in the attic that individual German soldiers and Italian whatever soldiers took, and they're beginning to realize that this was war loot, and it's very valuable. Now, how does that work?
Well, if they can identify it and if it can be, and they are willing to have it researched, then it is possible to tell what it is and the like. That many things, of course, were taken. It was a war, so many things were taken that did not necessarily belong to Jews, but that were taken simply by individual soldiers and the like. And that has happened. That the return of those items has occurred over the years, at various intervals. The that's a major issue, a major problem. I would call to your attention the fact that there's something very interesting in the Netherlands that is occurring for the first time right around now, which is that the Dutch have opened as of January 1st, 2025, the records, the archives of the collaborators. That is to say, showing who the collaborators
Yeah.
were. You couldn't previously search those records by anything else if you didn't know the name of the collaborator. And so, of course, most people didn't. It's not the case. However, now it is possible to search by the names of the victims, and also it's clear that in the collaboration there were lots of things having to do with property. So we're talking for the first time about the question of records which may be relevant to the question of what is held in private hands. And that is a big change, and it's not quite clear how that will be handled, but that's one thing. I would call to your attention too, by the way, the fact that there is a lot of stuff that is of Jewish communal interest that has been auctioned over the years, and which, because it belongs to the Jewish community, not to any one individual, it's clear that it does not belong in individual hands. And so we have been trying to deal with the question of the Pinkasim, for example, the registries of birth, death, and so forth, that are clearly communal registries, and that they really don't belong in individual hands, but should be made available to people generally, and certainly to the community from which they came. So that's a whole nother thing. I don't know if you want to go into detail
No,
about
but
that.
I hadn't thought about that, and I'm keeping an eye on the time. And there was something that I wanted to ask you about. A few years ago, all that art that was found in the Munich apartment of the son of the what's going on there now? I forget. Switzerland got the right. What's that story?
Well, Switzerland, all right, this is the Gurlitt Trove. So,
Yes.
so this was the son of Hildebrand Gurlitt, who was one of the main art dealers for Hitler, and who actually sold many of those pieces that you were talking about before that were, that were degenerate or whatever, and the like. Anyhow, with the Gurlitt Trove was taken over by Switzerland because he had left it to the Bern Museum, and there has been a lot of research done on what these things are and where they come from and are they stolen and such. Not everything are things that were taken from people, but some are, and that I think has been worked out pretty reasonably over time. Many of these things, those things that could be returned, I think pretty much have been, and there are other items where it's arguable, it's not clear. And the presentation of these I'm afraid that the presentation of these in museums has not always been as good as it might be. It tends to be a presentation which talks mostly about Gurlitt and talks mostly about the items, but doesn't really go into the extent to which these things are possibly stolen and what that means.
I would,
Not, it may be an unfair.
so two quick questions. One, I want to go back and just say, without that's a really interesting concept about individuals owning things that belong to Jewish communities. And I think I'd never thought about that. But I wanted to make it clear to the audience that you can, I don't know, I don't think the word, that there is a process by which if you were forced to sell at a really, really, really low price because to escape, that is considered being stolen, even though you quote sold it. Is that correct?
Yes, it's correct. And let me say that there was a very interesting thing that has happened in the last year. Uh, there was in 2024, a year ago, in March, there was the presentation of the best practices for the Washington Conference principles.
Hmm.
This was headed by the State Department of the United States, and the World Jewish Restitution Organization, but at the present time there are 30 countries that have endorsed those best practices. And among the best practices was the idea that if something was sold indeed uh, which indeed was a forced sale, or a sale that was done for Fluchtgut or for flight goods. In other words, person who was trying to escape and took something with him that he then sold. Let's say escaped to Switzerland and you sold the painting. That could also be considered looted property because from the standpoint of the victim, there's no difference. And it was very interesting that the Birler collection in Switzerland, the Birler collection is was is essentially being shown in Zurich, and this was something which was major of major controversy because Birler had been known to have dealt in arms and other such things for the Nazis. So the Birler collection, upon the Switzerland agreeing to these best practices, proceeded to say, okay, this means we need to take those things that we know are of that sort, and we need to discuss their fate with the heirs of the people who were victimized. And that's a whole new area, and that's within the last year. And I don't know how widespread it will be, but that's the case.
But I think we can conclude that I know this sounds weird in a way, but that things are improving for the restitution of stolen art. Would you say that that's correct?
Yes and no. They are improving in a large number of countries, but there are a large number of countries which refuse to do anything. Remember, I started off by saying that half of the countries that endorse the Washington Conference principles have really not done anything. So if we are looking at countries such as uh, Albania, Australia, Belarus, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Brazil, Bulgaria, Cyprus, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Ireland, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Moldova, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Portugal, Romania, Russian Federation, Spain, Turkey, Ukraine, Uruguay. It's not the case.
And some of those countries I was very surprised about without going into taking away. I mean, Denmark. I mean,
Denmark didn't. Denmark claims that they did not actually. There wasn't anything that was taken because because of the rescue of the Jews. Uh, Many of the Jews who were rescued, who came back to their homes in Denmark, did indeed find that everything was there and it was fine. There were people who, of course, came back and some things were taken, but it was not quite the same kind of thing. The question in Denmark is whether through the art market there were things that are in Denmark or that were or whatever. But that it's not a major matter, but it's something Denmark has not done provenance research on its collections, so it's hard to tell. There's another matter.
and just to reiterate, provenance means searching who owned it, who owned it, who owned it, was it sold fairly, blah, 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 blah. As far
It,
back as as far back as when the art was created, is that correct?
yes, provenance research is research on the history of ownership of the artwork, and yes, and sometimes that's a very long, long provenance. If you go back to I don't know, Rembrandt and company, yes, sure.
This has been a fascinating conversation. Is there anything you think that we didn't discuss? I mean, we could go on for hours, but that you would really like my listeners to know? We're going to include, I think, the Jewish digital. link or something on this description so people can, we'll choose. We'll choose a link to share.
Well, that's
And
the JDCRP is what you're talking about. The Jewish Digital Cultural Recovery Project is new. It's new, and there is a website, but it should be getting more prominent later this year. And that's one thing. I think the thing that I'd like to note is that in terms of Holocaust education and anti-Semitism and the like, one of the things that is clear is that even experts on the history of the Holocaust pay attention to the murder. And that's understandable because it's the murder of 6 million people and more. And that's, and that's the most important thing. But they don't pay attention to the theft. The theft is basically pretty unknown, and it is not looked at by a great many countries that are concerned with Holocaust education and the like. Now that the survivor generation is passing, there is a good probability that one of the ways to handle interest in the Holocaust and understanding the Holocaust is actually by looking at, from an educational standpoint, is looking at the theft. It's easier for young people to understand here was an artwork or here was a porcelain or whatever the case may be that belonged to someone, and look at what happened to it. I think that's a point I should make to you.
I like that point very much because I'll just tell you this one quick story without the whole thing. Anyway, a group of students from my hometown of Elgin, Illinois, we took them to the Chicago museum, a Holocaust museum, and they saw these real artifacts. And they said, "Is that real? Is that real?" So then the next day, when they were speaking, extemporaneously answering questions in front of 200 teachers, someone said something. So the student said, it was that blanket made out of burlap that she clung to. That hit them in a way. Isn't that interesting? That the stories of people, but the physical thing that they could relate to. And they knew that by this point, they knew that it was real. They had asked, it wasn't a facsimile. Just two different students of like the 11 students had focused on that. And I thought, that's really interesting. So I think that your point about as survivors die out, that these objects can be a much stronger connection for young people than, I'm sorry, but 6 million dead people is like so incomprehensible that it's just, but when you see one little blanket and you think of one little girl, you go, because you put yourself in that story. So I thank you so much, Wesley. Really, this has just been so informative. And I thank our listeners. But as I have to say at the end of each show, I do say, may the memory of the victims and all those people who tried to save them be a blessing forever.